Let's stay with education issues. The COVID-19 pandemic was one of the biggest contributors to the lack of reading in schools. And that's according to the Basic Education Department themselves. Now they've come up with a holistic plan to address illiteracy. An international study, a very worrying study, found that over 80% cannot read for understanding, and that's a big issue. Let's speak now to the University of Johannesburg's education professor, Prof. Mary Metcalfe, making time for me this afternoon. Hello to you, Prof. Good to have you back on eNCA with us. I mean, just how worrying is that when we know that I think it's grade 4s, if I remember the report, saying that many of them cannot read for meaning, because that's a foundational stage of education. Doesn't exactly set them up, does it?
You're right, Gareth. If young learners in grade 4 are not confident in reading, are not being able to read for pleasure, read for meaning, and who don't have constant access to reading material, it does set them up for struggling from grade 4 onwards, where the curriculum becomes much more content and textbook orientated. So we do need to do much more to get our young learners reading more confidently.
And yet, Prof, we're seeing reports coming out as well of Angie Motshekga maintaining that grade 4s can read for meaning, even going as far as to suggest that it had something to do with the number of official languages that we have in our country, and this research didn't take that into account. Is that holding any water for you?
Well, I did not see her press conference, and I doubt that she said that, and I hope she didn't, because we need young learners to be reading in their home language, the language that they're most familiar with, and it's easier to learn to read in a language that you're familiar with. So all of the learners who wrote the Pearls test did write it in their home language, and the results were looking at their ability to read with comprehension in their home language. But Gareth, if you'll allow me, I do think that some of the negativity around these results fails to take into account several things. Number one, that all of the countries, nearly all of the countries, other than about 7, I think, that were participating in the study, all experienced a decline because of COVID, because we cannot underestimate the impact of COVID. The second thing is that the line that came out as the headline was, "Our children cannot read for meaning." Now, they can read for meaning, the majority of them. The extent of how many of them can read for meaning would probably range between 70–80%, but it's reading for meaning at what level, and is that level sufficient for grade 4 in reading in English? Why I want to stress that is because the test items, we participated voluntarily and we should continue to participate, but we're comparing ourselves against the best countries in the world. I did a kind of ranking of the countries, mostly Europe, ex-Soviet Union, Asia. The minister, I think, in a press statement said 3 countries in Africa, but in the 47 countries ranked, we were the only country from sub-Saharan Africa. The test item that I looked at most closely was a very complex reading on octopuses, octopi. And to translate that into African languages, which of course had to happen, would have been a very complex exercise and a very long reading passage. So, for example, I have fun talking to African language speakers, people familiar with various African languages, and say, please translate for me into an African language that you're familiar with this phrase: octopus arms have suction caps. Now, that actually requires several sentences to explain. So our learners did not compete favorably with those countries, but it doesn't mean that they cannot read for meaning at simpler levels. And that is not to say we don't have a problem, but we need to be more positive about the views of our teachers and that work that they're putting in, and the fact that there have been some extraordinarily useful results of trials of improvement, strategies for improving reading, that the DBE is beginning to really listen to and incorporate into their plans. Those plans need to be very thorough, programmatic, well-resourced, and monitored. But I think there is hope.
I certainly hope so. And let's now look at the concerns around, and just by the way, for the record, Prof, I think you have corrected me quite rightly in that it wasn't the 11 languages that was being blamed for the bad results. It was part of the Pearls system. So I do thank you for the correction. I think I did mishear that headline while driving in today. So thank you for the correction. My apologies for the error. But I do want to find out, for these grade 4s that were tested in a case like this, as you say, there is still a concern. There are concerns there. Where do we start going back to fix this? So it doesn't happen in future. And then what happens to the grade 4s now that have got these concerns with their reading? How do we get them back up to speed, if that's a rather badly phrased term?
No, it's a wonderful question, because you see the grade 4 is like a dipstick in a pot. It's not only the grade 4s. Our children have been struggling with reading over decades. The results from previous Pearls, the results from other studies are saying that we have to do more about reading. So the intensity of the support perhaps needs to focus on the early grades, grade R, 1, 2, 3, 4, but we also need to be ensuring that learners in grades 5, 6, 7, 8 are getting access to reading books. You know, somebody said, and I really loved it, you learn to drive by driving. You learn to play soccer by playing with the ball. You learn to read by reading. So the more that we can make sure that children have access to reading materials is one of the most critical things in their home language and increasingly in the language of instruction. So what do? I think that the biggest area that I'm certainly going to be pushing in my work, and I'm talking there about National Planning Commission and its interest in this area, is to get credible plans that are properly aligned between national and provincial, that are properly resourced and adequately resourced, and the funds are there, and the teacher support is there, and the material is there. And we need to monitor implementation, not only monitor implementation, actually knowing how many teachers have been trained, who's got the books, what's happening in terms of support, but we also need to monitor the progress of learners much more regularly. We can't wait for Pearls every, 5 years to tell us that we're not doing more. It must be teachers. Yeah, you with me. Yeah.
I am, Prof. I wanted to ask this as well. So while we don't necessarily wait for the next Pearls to come out and we try and measure this, that's all great. You can have the tools in place. You can have the hopes of doing this. Do we have the skill sets to actually do all this measurement and implementation? There is only one Mary Metcalfe in the country. We'd have to replicate you a few times to get this done. If you don't have the specialists that can measure this and implement this and make the changes, it's all going to be for naught in the end.
Fortunately, there's a lot of people that are better than me and a lot of people active in this area. There's academics across the country, Prof. Fleisch at Wits, Ursula Hoadley at UCT, and some of the best people are actually in the DBE. And they have been doing thorough research, developing mechanisms for benchmarking, developing mechanisms for rapid assessment. What we need to do is to move our teachers and the system to understanding that the best measurements should be used to identify where support is needed, and that the measurements are not there for punitive purposes. They're not there to say that you're not doing well. They should be there to say, how can I help you? I think we've got the capacity to do it.
And Prof, just as I say goodbye to you, I'm sure there could be parents of a grade 4 pupil watching this. They would have seen this report, at least the media coverage of that report when it came out, and said, my child is in grade 4, they're going to be a failure, they're going to be unemployable for this. for this cohort, for this year. Just set their mind at ease if you can, that all is not lost. This can be rectified. We know there were issues from COVID, but this can be rectified if I understand our conversation correctly.
Absolutely, it can be rectified, and I'm glad that you've introduced the question of parents, because parents can use every opportunity they can to make reading part of everyday life, make reading something that's enjoyable, make reading something that children gain confidence in, because it's that confidence in reading, it's a growing vocabulary, it's the understanding that reading is actually about pleasure and learning. That will be the greatest asset that we have in improving going forward.
At the moment you realize that a book is not just for school, but it's actually a way of learning, and it's actually fun and educational at the same time. That's where the real fun starts. I was a Roald Dahl fan myself back in the day. Mary Metcalfe, Prof, thank you very much. Indeed, I'm not saying Roald Dahl served me any good, but I managed to get this far. Prof, thank you very much indeed. Education specialist from the University of Johannesburg. So it's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it looks like there are plans in place. But as the Prof says, those parents, caregivers, teachers, whatever it might be, of little grade 4s, where this focus of the study was, all is not lost. There's nothing to panic about as yet, but certainly keep a very close eye on how your schools are handling the situation.